Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another live webinar by COBRA. We have Singular on once again on a Friday afternoon. We're indebted to them as COBRA for giving us the opportunity to broadcast insightful information, in particular their ideas in relation to where South Africa and the world currently finds itself in. Only last night we had news of various stages in relation to uplifting the lockdown and the natural implications to various industries. You'll have seen that the hospitality and restaurant industry, the document goes so far as to say that they will not reopen even after the lockdown. So there may have been an ambiguity in the document, but it appears from the document and a plain reading of the document that the intention is, when it comes to hospitality and restaurants, that this be long-term. Singular is a consultancy firm. They have offices around the world, Europe, South Africa, Russia. I'm the managing partner of Schindler's Attorneys. We are a co-founder of COBRA, together with Engaged Business Turnaround and IQ Business Group. We formed COBRA a month ago in reaction to President Ramaphosa's call to arms. He called upon businesses to come together and to do whatever they can to assist in this pandemic. And we've had an absolutely amazing reaction. We are onboarding partners on a daily basis. Our partners have been more than giving. They've all agreed to provide pro bono services. And yeah, COBRA's indebted to them and COBRA's indebted to Singular. So I'm going to hand over to Lorenzo and Annalene. They'll be presenting today. Yeah, it sounds like quite an exciting topic, and I'm certainly going to be most interested to hear from them. So thank you. Over to the two of you. Thanks, guys.
Excellent. Hello, everybody, and welcome. And it's good to sort of have this second engagement where we can share our thoughts, our current thoughts on what's happening and what we can expect going forward. As you know by now, the structure of our document will look at the healthcare sort of implication of the situation that we are living right now, the economic implication, and then as we go through week by week, we will talk ever more about the business implications and what can we practically do as a business to make the best of this big threat that has a few opportunities nonetheless. Now I'll hand over to I'm Lorenzo. I'm one of the founding partners of Singular Group, and I'm gonna hand over to the presentation to Annalene and Rohit, who are managers in the business, and I'll intervene during the conversation, and then I would love to have some more Q&A than we managed to have last time, so that we can get as specific and as useful as possible to you and your business right now.
Great.
Annalene?
Thank you, Lorenzo. I think let's just kick it off straight into the content. So if we look at the slide that's presented in front of you right now, I'm going to do a short recap on some of the insights that were presented in the last presentation. So what's interesting about the slide is that if you look at studies by scientists quite recently, particularly on 3 case studies, one being Iceland, the second being the Diamond Princess scenario in Japan, as well as looking deeper into the asymptomatic cases that exist in Wuhan, what scientists have realized that the COVID virus is actually much more widespread than was recently reported. And the reason behind this is twofold. So one is that there is a lack of data, a lack of scaled testing. So you only know what you can measure. The second reason is really around the aspect of asymptomatic cases. So it takes about 2 to 3 weeks for an asymptomatic case to actually show symptoms, meaning so there are a lot of hidden cases or people that exist today that could have COVID-19 and we just don't know about it. So this is a quite interesting story. the studies show that potentially for every 1 case that goes reported out there, 4 to 7 cases are actually going undetected. If we take this into South African context, what that means is that we have around 3,900 recorded cases today. Okay, so that's the middle of the pyramid. And potentially about 10,000 to 19,000 is actually going undetected, or that's the total, which would lead to a 76 death rate that exists today, which would mean our mortality range is around 0.4 to 0.7%. Okay, so that's good news and bad news. The good news is that our mortality range is much, much lower than we have been reporting. But the bad news is that we potentially have a lot of hidden cases that exist today. So the outcome of this is, 1, testing is very, very crucial. The more testing we do, the more we know, and the more we can actually mitigate. So if we move on to the next slide and we take this concept of testing further, we've plotted on a graph for you the number of tests per 1,000 population against the percentage of positive tests. And if you look at South Africa, which is on the bottom left corner of this graph, South Africa has a very low positivity of tests, meaning for all the tests that South Africa does, very little shows up to be positive, okay, around 3%. The global average is around 10%, okay? So it's quite good news. We have a low positivity. But if you compare that to the total amount of tests that South Africa does, we actually have a very low confidence about our results, okay? So our testing seems positive, but it's low. And if you look at other countries that are that were in the range that South Africa is today, 30 days ago, they have been capable, were able to actually ramp up their testing over time. For example, if you look at Norway on this graph, they were also in this yellow pyramid, that column that we see, and they were able to actually grow their tests over time. But the trend that we see here for all of these countries is as they grow their tests, their positivity also increases, meaning that as you scale up your testing, you will detect more cases, so you'll become more widespread, you'll be better at locating these hotspots, but that also means that the rate of your positivity is going to increase. So South Africa needs to prepare for that. There could be a situation where it projects like Norway, where it's just a small increase in the positivity of our tests, or it could be a projection like the United Kingdom, where it's a massive increase in the positivity of our tests. Moving to the next slide.
Maybe just one comment on this one is that there is, let's say, a good possibility slash hope that we are much more in the Norway, let's say, situation, driven by the fact that we started the lockdown a lot earlier compared to when the UK started it, vis-a-vis their first cases appearing. So if we do continue to keep strict social distancing and a controlled release, there is, on the balance, in our opinion, more possibilities to go the Israel, Germany, Norway route rather than the Turkey, UK, Belgium route.
Thank you. There's a second factor to this. So scaling of your tests is one factor, but the second factor is really about time. So your ramp up time to the scaling. And in the graph in front of you, what's interesting about this graph is if you look at the green shade. So countries that have tested early, meaning that they've tested at least 1% of their population 20 days after their 100th case, have a lower rate of deaths than countries that have not. Okay, so they have managed to flatten the curve by testing early, knowing early, and mitigating. Okay, if you compare this to South Africa, South Africa has 0.2% of the population, 0.18% if you have to be precise, that's being tested at day 20. Okay, so we're actually moving towards the red zone when it comes to testing. So the takeaway here is that we're at the brink of where we need to ramp up very quickly before we accelerate our deaths. Okay, moving to slide 13, Rohit.
So the green area basically shows what you need to do in terms of speed or ramp up of testing to really flatten the curve. So what we hear in the media, the flattening of the curve, if you want to put that in numbers, in terms of speed at which you speed up the testing, reaching at least 1% of the population within the first 20 days is a good proxy of the kind of speed you need to have. South Africa started strong, but still lagging a little bit behind vis-a-vis the 1%. So we hope that the testing really speeds up and increases fast.
Thank you. Okay. So if we take this testing into account and we project scenarios that could occur post-lockdown. So what do we think will happen beyond this lockdown that's going to occur on the 1st of May? There's 3 potential cases. So the one case, which is the base case, this middle column, is the fact that our infection rate will grow, okay? Because we're reaching the peak of our curve, but we really need to think about how this infection rate will go in the future. So option 1 is that it grows by 2 times the rate in which it's growing today. That's around 600 cases per day, okay? We know that it will grow because these hidden cases that occur will infect our population post-lockdown, but we expect tracing and the ramp up and the segmented release to mitigate that, just as the president has announced yesterday. So that's the base case. In the worst case scenario, which is the right-hand side of the column, we expect a different sort of scenario to happen. We expect the infection rate to grow by 3 times X. So that's around 800 cases per day. In this scenario, we expect for potential hotspots to occur. So we don't expect a wide viral spread of the infection, but rather hotspots in particular concentrates both in urban and rural areas. And as a result, they could potentially be isolated shutdowns. So moving back to a level 4, not nationwide, but in specific isolated areas. In this case, and in the base case, and in the best case, where we just grow by 400 cases per day, we expect that the critical bed capacity, meaning the health capacity, to still be sufficient. And the reason behind this is that our lockdown has actually flattened our curve thus far. Okay, so our death rate, our fatality rate, which is the best indicator of a lockdown, is actually much lower, almost half of that of European countries and twice that of South Korea. So we're not the best, but we're actually quite good.
Let me just ask, guys, there's probably a microphone open in the background. If everybody apart from Annalene could mute themselves.
I think I've been muted. No, I haven't. Okay, I've been unmuted. Thank you. So these are the 3 scenarios that we see unfolding in the future in South Africa. These scenarios will result in a range of potentially 300 to 1,000 fatalities by the end of July. Okay, but I think the key takeaway from this is that this fatality range is still much lower than that of European countries that existed today within this time frame. And it means that we're still in a good position in terms of health capacity. So the lockdown has worked and we have been able to flatten the curve. So now I think what we'd like to do is present to you some economic outcomes of these scenarios. So Rohit, maybe you could take the presentation forward and present to us the economic implications.
Right, thanks, Annalene. Just continuing with the logic of the 3 cases which were introduced by Annalene. The rate of infection in the country would also determine the responses which could be potentially employed by the government, which would be in terms of the duration of days taken to go from level 5 to the level 2, which was as announced by the president last evening, which could be around 61 days in the best case to around 92 days in the worst case. The next level could be the restrictions or the level of strong measures which are being forced for the business to impose in order to control the transmission of the spread, which could be low to moderate over the next 35 days, could be low to moderate or even lower over the 75 days in the worst case scenario. Accordingly, there could be different inputs for fiscal policy response by the government. Already a stimulus package of 500 billion rand has been announced, but under different scenarios, we can assume what would be the actual rate of transmission, whether it would be 100% transmitted to only 50% transmitted in the worst case. And then we have some assumptions in terms of the monetary policy response from 4.25% repo rate currently announced to further repo rates going up to 3.25% in the worst case. With all of these policy responses and working on the duration of the staggered release, which we would see in the cases, as well as the GDP contribution of the sectors, which we would see, we have tried to bottom-up estimate what could be the level of GDP contraction in 2020 versus 2019. Taking the example of wholesale, retail, trade, hotels, and restaurant, which is the third icon which you see on the screen right now. This industry segment contributes around 15% of the GDP in 2019. In the best case, we assume that during the lockdown, the GDP contribution from this particular industry was around 41%, and it will gradually ramp up to around 60% in the level 4, which would start from 1st May, going up till 87% by the end of the year. And that is just the base case. Now, obviously, we would not be at 100% capacity due to the supply side constraints which are imposed, and also due to the restriction in the consumer spending, which will happen as the economy goes into a distress. Overall, this leads us to a contraction of around 15% in the base case. Sorry, in the best case, going up till 23% in the worst case. Similarly, if we do this bottom-up analysis for all the other sectors and combine the total results, we end up with a GDP contraction of around 10% in the best case to around 17% in the worst case in real terms. Now, this is slightly more negative than the view we had last time, but what we have updated here is the consideration that based on the announcement, we should be prepared for a longer haul of restrictions, and it would not be that we recover very fast to the business as usual days as we knew before the corona outbreak came into play. On the next slide, we just summarize.
Sorry, right. Maybe let me just, let's say, add to this that on a week by week basis, we'll be updating with the best and latest information that we have. And we will also increase in precision bottom up so that we can give everyone, ideally by, in a few months' time, a lot of the subsectors that you guys that are listening in belong to, a view of how your specific subsector could be impacted. So we'll try and do this exercise on an ever more granular bottom-up level.
Right. Some of you might remember the slide we had presented last time as well. What we're showing here is that the GDP contraction range could be from 10% now to around 17%, which would obviously impact the recovery as well. In the current cases that we have right now, the recovery of lost GDP, almost 70% of that, is expected to only happen by Q3 of 2024 to around Q3 of 2027, which is dependent on the GDP growth rate of South Africa over the next few years, and also the level of contraction which we might see in the different cases. Okay. Then I would like Annaline to quickly cover the third section in terms of what the companies can actually do about this particular crisis and turn it into an opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Rohit. Okay, so very useful. So if we go into the next slide. Okay, so I mean, taking this economic impact into account, we're at this critical point where, yes, there is opportunities and there's losses. And the way companies need to mitigate this is twofold. So one, you would need to think about how you need to respond, and your response team itself, or your response plan itself, needs to consist of what we call a SWOT team. And the purpose of the SWOT team is actually to provide an internal first line of defense for your company. By doing this, one, the SWOT team will need to make rapid decisions on the field. Two, collect and incorporate facts and intelligence like a typical SWOT team would do from different sources, be it an expert, be it the market, be it technology advisors, and make a very immediate, quick decisions on big wins. Okay, because in this Black Swan event, there's two things that a SWAT team needs to consider, or a business in general needs to consider. One is time, so delivering with speed, and secondly, making sure you're delivering a very, very big win to turn around. This SWAT team would typically consist of an executive who's the decision maker in the team. So be it a CEO, a CPO, CFO, and within that, very crucial advisors, a legal advisor, financial advisor, and a people advisor, because there's going to be big structural changes in your business model itself. Okay. There also needs to be a specialist in the SWAT team. Okay. Typically a technology specialist, a lean specialist, really dependent on the task at hand. Okay. We typically advise that when you're building these SWAT teams, you need to build multiple teams itself, so multiple SWATs. Reason being is that this is a very long-term crisis. So there's going to be a period where there's a dip. The dip is going to stay for a while. There's going to be slow growth where you turn around, and then there's a bounce back. Okay, so it's a very long crisis that's going to occur. So in order for companies to have very sustained effectiveness, there needs to be multiple SWAT teams, almost like shift work. What's the purpose of this team? So the purpose of the team is going to look at a few key activities, and that is one, to create a very simple data room where you connect to multiple sources, multiple partners, very similar to the webinar that we're doing today. So collect as much information as you possibly can, okay? You need to start tracking key indicators, external indicators on the market as well as on your business. Build that into business scenarios that you can actually create response plans to, problem solve on a weekly basis, create your task teams, and then do very quick feedback loops with your CEO. So the SWAT team is going to be a very decentralized version of decision making, but in order for that to work, you need to have quick feedback loops with your CEO. If you move on to the next slide, okay. The SWAT team will consist or will look at multiple initiatives, okay? And these initiatives really depend on the financials of a company, okay? In a situation where you're financially distressed, your focus during the fall period, for example, needs to focus more on understanding how these scenarios will impact your P&L, okay? And use this understanding to make aggressive decisions on your cash, okay? Be it optimizing your working capital, restructuring your labor costs, managing your supply by negotiating with suppliers on payment terms. Once you have cash in hand, your next step in a moderate sort of financial situation during the fall is to preserve your revenue. So call up your customers, get a minimum pricing negotiation started, and preserve your baseline as much as possible. Ensure that your supply chain is continuing. And lastly, lead your team during this crisis by continued communication. In a healthy situation, so once you've preserved your revenue, once you have cash in hand, the next step is to create a post-COVID better you. And this is about trying to understand what are the good value for money, almost cheap, I would say, acquisitions that are out there and available today. How can you use those opportunities, such as digitization, to improve your business model? And in general, how can you improve your business model, taking into account the opportunity post-COVID? If we go on to the next slide, these are some examples that a SWAT team can do during the fall, be it scenario planning to working capital optimization. I'm not going to go into detail in the slide for the sake of time, but we've presented it last week. I think what's interesting is if we move to the next slide, Rohit. The next one, yeah, is the turnaround. So during these initiatives of a SWAT, there's going to be a period where SWAT needs to consider how do we change the way we work post-lockdown. And there's three key initiatives SWAT needs to consider. So one, you need to mitigate the risk of COVID itself within your company. And typically what we're seeing in China is that they've been setting up distributed but coordinated operating models, okay? And these distributed operating models actually mitigate or try to reduce the spread of COVID-19 within your company itself, okay? For example, minus are actually creating isolated team shifts. So teams that are actually isolated from each other, they're in contact with each other within the team, but the teams itself in multiple groups are isolated from each other to ensure that if a COVID-19 case does occur in the company, it does not spread to another team. So creating distributed but coordinated operating models can help reduce the spread within your company post-lockdown. The second step that SWOT needs to consider is performance of your teams. So we're going through a period where motivation levels are low. Motivation levels are low. And the reason behind this is, one, you're working remotely, and surveys show that employees that work remotely, whether they want to or not, have a 17 to 20% less motivation when they were working in an office. And this is linked more to the lack of social interaction within teams. Okay? We're also going through a black swan event, meaning there's lots of uncertainty that's occurring right now. So motivation levels are going to be low, but at the same time, SWOT really needs teams to buckle down to actually push faster through this turnaround. Okay? So there needs to be deep engagement and drive to create and push intrinsic motivation of teams. And we'll give you a practical example shortly on this. The third step SWOT needs to consider is speed. Okay, the key winners that will come out of this turnaround are the winners that make, or are the companies that make decisions really quickly. In order for you to do that, you need to decentralize your power. So the CEO cannot have all of the decision-making power in the situation. Decentralizing is key. So SWOT will need to create accountability in multiple streams with multiple decision makers, so splitting the executive power around and decentralizing this decision-making power with short feedback loops and governance. Okay, if we go on. So this is a practical example of how SWOT has worked in Europe, for example, to create intrinsic motivation in the employees during this period. So if you look at these companies in Europe, Toyota, Unilever, Vodafone, and UniCredit Bank, they have all adapted this technology called Beacon Force. And what Beacon Force does is an app that you download as an employee, and it allows you to have the following capabilities. So one, as an employer, you can send push notifications and mass communication to your employees. So it's a way in which you can actually communicate to multiple employees remotely. Okay. You can also send surveys to employees to get a dipstick understanding of what's going on. What's interesting about this app, it actually tracks employee motivation. So it sends 2 questions per day to your team and you answer it, and it tracks the intrinsic motivation. So are my employees actually happy or not? And what is the reasoning behind it? So it collects data analytics on the motivation of your employees. And lastly, it gives a self-reflection to employees so they can understand themselves how they can improve their engagement and working as a team during this crisis. So this is a real life example of how companies in Europe are trying to understand the social distancing aspect and use technology to solve the problem. Okay. So if you take the story all together, your SWOT team is going to first help you survive the fall and support you on cash initiatives, revenue preservation. It's then going to help you structure your business model and set up the way your team should work going forward. And through these steps, SWOT is actually going to snowball into an ecosystem. The reason behind this is that SWOT is going to continuously collect data from these different sources. It's going to continuously source different partners for solutions to solve these different problems all along the way. And as a result, you as a business will eventually build an ecosystem of partners, be it traders, be it investors, be it technology partners, be it government, be it suppliers, that will actually feed into your ecosystem and help you solve this problem. This is very, very critical because in a black swan event itself, it's really not possible for one company to have all of the data or to collect all of the data and solve all of the solutions in speed. Okay, so given the business complexity of a black swan event and the need for speed, an ecosystem approach is the next step to you coming out of this turnaround.
And I mean, just to add on top of this, we've seen organizations organizing themselves as ecosystems, as neural networks, obviously also before the outbreak. What we'll see in the future is this tendency or this theory or this, let's say, habit spreading a lot further the typical software company or Google or Facebook of the situation into much more of how organizations work in general. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So I think the last slide of our presentation today is about structural changes, which is a very important part. So we've considered the SWOT setup, which is the short-term initiatives you need to consider as a business to go through this turnaround. There's a long-term view that you also need to keep in mind, okay? And it's threefold. One, there's going to be drivers that are going to shift industries, okay? So these drivers are your regulations by government, your geopolitics, and your consumer behavior. Government is going to set up new privacy laws. For instance, if you look at South Korea today, they've lifted all privacy laws to allow for very stringent and extensive tracing of COVID cases. There's going to be new healthcare systems and regulations that exist. We have already seen this by Cyril Ramaphosa's announcement on the different levels of lockdown. That will change even at a regional level. Geopolitics are going to have a play. Protectionism is also going to have a big play here. And we see shifts in consumer behavior itself, okay? Consumer behavior is going to move more towards the essentials, as we've seen today. There's going to be a move towards e-commerce, new shopping channels, and it becoming more digital. And that's going to impact the industry threefold. One, we see a movement to digitization, okay? So smart working, digital infrastructure like your telecoms and your communication. There's going to be, secondly, reshoring and offshoring. Okay, a good example of this is Japan. Japan is already spending almost $2 million to move its production out of China. So there's going to be a movement towards local production. Again, our president has already started talking about this in his nation address about reshoring and localizing down the value chain. But at the same time, there's going to be offshoring. There's going to be offshoring of specific services. For instance, you are working more remotely, so there's even more opportunity for you to connect with a software company in Silicon Valley to help you solve your problems. So there's going to be offshoring as well. The last is going to be a movement towards health and hygiene. Every company is going to become an expert in health and hygiene, whether they like it or not. Regulations are going to push it towards this way. As we've seen, SWOT teams within companies are pushing towards changing our operating models to improve and decelerate any contact of COVID-19 within their employees. Okay. And what does this mean at the end? At the end, there's going to be new winners. So these are the winning sectors that are going to come out of COVID-19. And it's food for thought for businesses to consider when they're looking at the long-term opportunities. Okay, so we're going to see a movement towards e-commerce and logistics infrastructure. Okay, we need logistics infrastructure for us to move and grow into e-commerce itself. Okay, secondly, movement into hygiene and sanitation. Lots of e-learning going on right now. Fintech and insurance, digital healthcare, medical technology, as well as digital entertainment. I think it's
maybe just a couple of examples. I mean, if you think about e-learning, what's interesting in this phase is the combination of a few things happening at the same time. I mean, lots of people having a lot of time at home. The fact that you have universities the like of Harvard, for instance, all of a sudden offering a hell of a lot of free content and free courses to obviously attract people to sort of change from an executive education that used to happen offline to an executive education that is happening online. And then at the same time, the increasing need that we'll see in the next few months and few years of reskilling of people, because as the mix of products and services demanded changes, also the mix of competencies changes that is needed. And therefore the need of employment, the employment mix changes. So these three factors that are happening together, this is just to deep dive into the sort of education part. you can see how they all play together to reshape not only the customer experience, but the whole value chain that lies behind it.
Yeah. I think on an industrial point of view, what we're seeing is miners, for example, are actually moving into healthcare more from a commodity space, thinking about what commodities are needed in the future for healthcare, such as copper, for example.
I don't know if people know, but copper has actually specific chemical and physical properties that make it such that the virus, and any virus really, survive on a copper surface a lot less than on other surfaces. So this is an example of how, as a commodity player, you can think about your product mix or your focus when it comes to growth in the future. Yeah. We successfully, fortunately this time, managed to sort of keep it a little bit more concise in a way that that we can allow for actually a lot of or a lot more Q&A if there is anybody interested in specific aspects that relates either to the presentation or their business. I think it would be great to hear from all of you guys, or some of you at least.
Exactly. We'd like to use this opportunity and this space to maybe answer any specific business questions you may have.
Yeah, thanks guys. This has been fantastic. So I encourage the viewers, please post questions. I mean, after all, this is a webinar. It could be quite easy to post videos and merely broadcast them. The idea behind a webinar is that you reach out and ask questions. I mean, we have some industry experts here, tap into their brains, tap into what Lorenzo referred to as a neural network. You have it, so please post your questions. I don't know, just on the mortality rates, Annalene, I mentioned it last week and I find it interesting that what I did, and I don't know if you guys have done it, but I extrapolated utilizing the death rate in America, but I extrapolated looking at Switzerland and how many deaths they had and how many active cases they had. And what I found, and this is about 3 days ago, is that in reality, America, having regard to the death rate, actually has in the region of about 24 million active cases. Have you guys looked at it? Have you done that exercise, Lorenzo?
Yes, just maybe to understand which part surprised you. Like, is it the fact that it's very spread in America, or the fact that...
I'll pull it up if I can. Share. So what I did was if you go to these figures over here, you'll see in America, there are 887,000 cases with only 50,000 deaths. Well, with 50,000 deaths. So what I did is I picked Switzerland and where is Switzerland? Here, and they got 28,000 cases and 1,551. So if you now extrapolate using 1,051, you divide this figure over here, and then you times it by the amount of active cases, that actually takes you to 24 million in America. I don't know if anybody's ever looked at that or whether my thinking is wrong, but you see what I did?
Yes, I mean, you looked at the prevalence in the US vis-a-vis Switzerland and the relative mortality rate.
Yeah,
I mean, the one thing... Yeah.
Sure.
No, the one thing to say about the US is that the US is really a continent more than a country, if you think about it in size, in the sense that you have within the US areas that are extremely heavily hit, like New York, and areas that are actually very much in the South Africa case cluster, if you think about it. So practically barely any case. And therefore, the whole sort of country average has some very worrying parts of the country, parts of the continent, and some, let's say, if you want, barely touched part of the country. So the average in the US is not the most telling number at this point in time, just like the average in China was not the most telling number at that point in time, because we had a very, very, very let's say, a high concentration in the area of Wuhan, and then they managed to completely isolate that area and therefore stop the spread. which meant that the country average, if you look at them, actually don't look too bad. But in the Wuhan area, which is the size of, call it the size of Belgium, there was obviously a massive spread. So I think here there's a bit of a dimension of country size factor that plays.
I think if you want to do this type of extrapolation, I would consider looking at it city by city, because this spread is mainly happening in New York if you look at the USA case, number one. Secondly, you also need to take into account the age population that is spreading within the country, because that has a big indicator of how your fatality would grow over time.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We do have some questions. You want to go for it?
Yes, I'm reading. Actually, I found on the app the Q&A. So first question from Anya. Thanks for the question. How do you see this affecting the tourism industry? A lost cause? Question mark. So I mean, the tourism industry, I think, let's say,
go back to that heat map slide and then you.
Which one?
Maybe we go back to the heat map slide before you answer the question.
Yeah, Rohit, if you want to change that page in the meantime. I believe we need to also change the screen. Yeah, but in a nutshell, I think the tourism industry will be, it's hard to sugarcoat it. I mean, we don't need to sugarcoat it. I think the tourism industry will be one of the most hit. And I don't believe personally it will be transformed for good. Certainly there will be some shifts, but in the short to medium term, it will be massively hit. Yeah. So I don't think it's a lost cause, but I think it's definitely on a relative scale. If you look at it industry by industry, is going to be one of the most affected. Especially, I mean, not only because tourism will be affected for a longer time in terms of supply constraints. So for how long the restrictions will apply when it comes to international travel and so on, but also because it's full of small businesses, and small businesses in these types of events and these types of crises are the ones that typically suffer the most because they just go bankrupt, which doesn't happen and we've learned this in the financial crisis. We've learned this in most of the previous in the past in most of the recessions that we see. I mean, the average small business has a couple of weeks of cash flow available without revenues, or cash flow reserves without revenues. So you can take that and compare it to a few months worth of lockdown and or restrictions of some sort, which are longer in the case of tourism, and that sort of unfortunately gives you the answer. On the other hand, and that's the good news, oftentimes tourism is also family-owned businesses, which typically have a lot more savings and a lot less gearing, a lot less debt on their balance sheet. So there is a possibility that a lot of those small businesses will just go into some sort of hibernation phase for a longer time, which they can afford because they are not indebted and they don't have gearing, at least many of them, and therefore they'll be able to then resurge when the borders reopen. To be kept in mind, one last factor, which I think is very important, is domestic tourism. So we'll see with a very, very high likelihood a phase of massively increased domestic tourism, driven by the fact that there is a lack of alternatives to begin with, and that should fill up a big chunk of the capacity and provide a buffer for that intermediate period whereby we can't have sort of international tourism. We have a second question on: do you honestly believe in Chinese statistics? I mean, there it's very hard to say. But let's put it this way. By now, the good news is that we don't really have to believe Chinese statistics because we have everybody's statistics. So right now, I think we rely to make any sorts of prediction very, very little on Chinese statistics. Yeah? Is it even possible to do a proper statistical analysis with the data which is not a hegemonic set? So I think it's right now, I mean, the real reality here is that it's very hard to do any statistically significant study. And we see this because because the situation is evolving so fast. So the best we can do is there are a few facts, and those facts are the ones that have been acknowledged as facts by scientific, properly done statistical studies, and there are some inferences. And the probability that those inferences will prove correct is increasing over time, but not all of them will prove correct. So you are very right in being skeptical about predictions and provisions, and that's why we are sort of trying to be, let's say, as open and transparent as we possibly can to say, look, let's evolve the best guess. Let's forget about the fake news and the news that make headlines, which typically are misleading. Let's try and put together the absolute best pieces of information that we can gather out there and piece together a story which is the best knowledge to date, acknowledging and being very humble on the fact that there is a lot of areas where there is many more questions than there is answers. In the plagues, in the Middle Ages, plagues in the Middle Ages, they would reoccur every 20 years or so. Is it expected that we can stave off this kind of reoccurrence with modern medicine? So my view on this is that, so I would be more worried about the seasonality of the virus and the fact that, given that we cannot really eradicate it completely, it will come back in waves, in smaller and smaller waves, but waves nonetheless, as the lockdown gets lifted, more than the reoccurrence, let's say, after generations. Yeah, this would be my bigger, let's say, worry, which doesn't mean that your thesis is not correct, but I think when it comes to this specific virus, there is a very high, or at least there is a probability that we will come up with a vaccine soon enough, in the sense, and when I say soon enough, the best guesses are around 12 to 18 months. It might be longer. We don't know, but what science seems to be saying is that the virus does not mutate as much as a virus like HIV, for instance. Otherwise, we would have big trouble to come up with a vaccine. That's why we didn't come up with a vaccine on HIV yet, because it mutates so much. So there is a possibility that we will come up with a vaccine and spread it and mass produce it within the next, call it, couple of years, which makes the 20-year plague risk less relevant. Obviously, this is full of ifs and full of unknown variables, but I would be more concerned about the management of subsequent smaller waves as we release the lockdown, and the potential seasonality of the virus, and therefore the virus coming back every winter until we get in a much more forceful, let's say, in a forceful way, until we get we come up with a vaccine, which creates the biggest and shortest term worry for Europe and the US and in general the whole Northern Hemisphere for the next winter, which is November, December, now upcoming. Yeah. So there's another. How much has the development/testing of potential vaccine been accelerated from the normal process? I mean, there is on this one, for what I know, there has been an acceleration, but so the short answer is we don't know. We will only know when at least we get into some of the phases that are, where the vaccine has been sort of identified, and then it moves from phase 1 to phase 2, etc., and it gets into more of a testing phase. Yeah. So to what extent are we speeding that up? It's, to me at least, still a question mark. I don't think there is very conclusive evidence, but my hope would be looking at the speed of change over the last 10 years in general, and the rate at which the speed of change has increased over the last 10 years in general, across fields, not only in the medical field. My strong assumption would be that we will have never seen a fastest vaccine, or at least, let's say, a mix of effective drugs and treatments to mitigate the complications, as we will have seen this time.
I think what we're doing well today is not really about speed, but at the rate in which we're finding new ideas for these vaccines. For instance, if you look at the concept of vaccination for COVID today, there are multiple different concepts that are being tested, okay? So one is the idea of like this blood donation of putting in antibodies into a human. The second idea is around a pure traditional vaccine itself. The third is around clinical trials of BCG and the effect of BCG on the severity of COVID. So it's really not about speed that's going on now, but it's about testing multiple things at the same time that would actually
in parallel, yeah.
Parallel, yeah.
Yeah, which will deliver speed of the outcome rather than the speed of each and every individual attempt.
Lorenzo, there's another question. It was posted to the chat, so I'll read it to you. Do you think Transnet freight rail will see the export demand for freight, such as iron ore, manganese, and coal, return to normal levels within the next year?
I mean, this question is probably, from an economic standpoint, the most complex, because this is very much driven by global demand. So we talked about other sectors that are more driven by local demand, domestic demand. This is driven very much by global demand, and to a big extent by Chinese demand, because we know 50% of most commodities end up in China. So the answer to this question depends very much on the speed at which the global economy will recover, because let's remember that China itself will not start building and producing stuff if other countries don't start demanding products from China. So it's all interconnected. Yeah. So my best guess is that it will take long. It will take. We will see an inflection in the commodity prices and the commodity cycle that will last longer than the immediate sort of virus crisis that we are witnessing right now. Whether that's 6 months, 12 months, or 18 months, I think it's a little bit too early to say. But I would expect a medium-term inflection in commodity prices to be rather longer than smaller, than shorter. There's a question here. Do you think the impact of non-governmental players such as Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation will revolutionize the development of further medicines? Well, I mean, it's hard to tell whether they will revolutionize it in this case, but what's for sure is that they've revolutionized, I think, the speed at which the field moves already in the last, I think, decade on other diseases. So I think it's a bit hard to comment on this specific case, but I think it's becoming ever more apparent that non-governmental players play an increasing role, and especially the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has been playing an incredible role in
the revolution or the evolution that we're seeing in this industry today is not really about the NGOs itself, but it's more about we're seeing a lot of partnership between medical technology companies and pharmaceutical companies to actually co-fund, co-develop solutions together. So this is the evolution that we're seeing, these private partnerships existing to develop a vaccine.
Public-private partnerships. So I think in a way what we said, the concept we illustrated of looking at your organization as an ecosystem, you can scale that concept and you can look at the whole, let's say, sectors working as an ecosystem. We see ever more of that. And this public-private partnership example is just one of the many examples in this field. I mean, the other, you see how tech companies that were competing against each other until yesterday are now partnering to sort of develop use cases for testing and tracing. We've seen it with Apple and Google. So we'll see ever more of this ecosystem approach rather than one player, one type of player approach.
Lorenzo, Annelien, before we conclude, just going back to tourism, last year I attended various courses held by Singularity University, San Francisco, in relation to exponential technology. And an observation that I've made is, has the COVID virus not, in a sense, accelerated certain of those technologies? And I've got a page which I'll show to you, but it relates to tourism, because what we were told last year was that tourism was already under threat. And the example they used was a Japanese airline, building robots to actually travel for you. And you'll see that here, the Japanese airline. Now, this is pre. So the airline created a division. They realized that the exponential technologies were a threat to the airline, and they began building avatars or robots with a view to you staying at home, putting a virtual reality goggles on, and you touring the Great Wall of China as an example. So, you know, when it comes to the tourism question, tourism, I've been told, and I don't know if you guys want to comment, it was under threat already, but obviously this is catastrophic and it's accelerated that. Do you have any comments around that? I just found it interesting.
Yeah, I think it is very interesting, and I think I completely agree with you on the statement that COVID gives an opportunity to a lot of exponential technologies to accelerate their spread and their development that was already in place. Yeah, and I think when it comes to virtual reality and sort of let's say tourism and the new normal, I think that's definitely one of the fields. My personal view is that we often are, as humans, we often think in extremes. My feeling is that in 5 years, so let's put ourselves 5 years ahead looking back. So in 5 years from now, looking back, my view is that tourism, the way we think about it now, will still be playing a substantial role, but we will see a number of different forms of tourism and entertainment that were possibly not there before, that will take a substantial share. So the two will just coexist, in a little bit like the way we've always had security measures at airports, but after 9/11, those security measures just became a lot more present and a lot more prevalent in our, let's say, journey from place A to place B via plane. Yeah. So I don't believe in extremes, especially not when it comes to human interaction and interactions of humans with nature, which is very much what tourism has to do with. But I do believe we will see a substantially increased mix of virtual reality-based experiences that will make up for, let's say, the entertainment area of our life. That for sure.
Yeah, I had this morning on the COBRA webinar, a tour guide who posed the question and said, must I start reskilling? Must I start looking for another job? And the point I made is that it's the same point that I think you're making, is one has to look at reskilling and innovation and new ideas. But the example I used is there's an app called Wonder, where on a Quest virtual reality, you can put your headset on and you can find yourself in any destination in the world, and you feel like you're there. It's in three-dimensional. It's off Google Street View, and there are opportunities there. You know, if I'm in the Botswana and I want to go for a tour, it's a virtual tour, but it would be good to have a guide tell me about the baobab trees and the like. So it's the same thing, but done in a different way. I see here the CEO, just to quote him, he says, by placing the world at your fingertips, Avatar will open up new possibilities and help reshape everything from business and education to health and entertainment. I think we can safely assume that this has been accelerated. This will happen sooner than when you anticipated when you made that comment. So if there's anything else that anybody wants to add? No further questions? I think that's it then. Thank you very much, guys. Thanks again to the Singular Group. It's fantastic to have you guys on board. Hopefully we'll see you more often. We are now going to be launching COBRA TV. We're going to be building content for an entire day's viewing of webinars and videos and the like, so watch out for that. Keep an eye out for go to the COBRA website. It's www.cobra.org.za. You'll get all the details there. We've also got further webinars coming up. There's certain webinars that are going to be targeted to the aviation industry. another direct to the hospitality industry. And the idea there is we're going to get the industry players. We've already secured 2 CEOs in the aviation industry to join us on the panel. So please take part in COBRA. If you are a company and you believe that you can add value, please join the COBRA ecosystem as the Singular Group does. To the panelists, thank you. Thank you, Singular Group. Well,
Thanks
just before I conclude,
yeah.
Will you be doing one of these anytime soon again? Because
yes, I mean, the value that we hope to bring to the decision makers community is very much by trying to sort of keep updating the view, because the environment is so volatile these days. So whether we will do this on a weekly basis or every second week, but certainly our let's say contribution and our wish is one of keeping on evolving the view as new information comes in, and thereby providing value to the decision makers out there. We also will spread and sort of diffuse the document if anybody is more interested in the details. We share it typically via LinkedIn on our page, so the Singular Group page on LinkedIn. So if anybody is interested in reading the fine prints and sort of studying the documents in more depth, I think it lends itself for a good read, whether you want to use it as an exco level or just as a consumer.
Fantastic. We're indebted to the Singular Group. Thank you, and hope to see you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.